A political earthquake has struck Britain, shaking the foundations of power in a way unseen in modern history. The UK Supreme Court has delivered a verdict so shocking, so unprecedented, that it has left Westminster in chaos and the nation in disbelief. With a ruling that carries the force of law, the highest court in the land has ordered Prime Minister Keir Starmer to resign immediately over a 124,000 scandal that has transformed from a financial dispute into a full-blown constitutional crisis. This isn't just about numbers on a balance sheet, this is about betrayal, corruption, and the collapse of trust at the heart of government. The very man who built his career on justice and integrity now stands accused of violating the principles he once defended, and Britain finds itself standing on the edge of political and legal upheaval. The ruling came down like a hammer from the heavens, its words reverberating across the nation with a force no politician could ignore. In a courtroom packed with journalists, legal scholars, and members of the public, Chief Justice Dame Sue Carr delivered the judgment with chilling clarity. The evidence, she declared, was overwhelming and undeniable. At the centre of the storm was a property in North London owned by Starmer's family, whose sale had been deliberately undervalued by £124,000. That sum was never declared, never recorded in the official register of interests, and never shared with Parliament. The omission was no clerical slip. It was, according to the judgment, a deliberate act of concealment. Adding fuel to the fire, documents revealed a string of hidden gifts, luxury perks, and undisclosed donations worth tens of thousands, secretly funneled from powerful backers with interests tied to offshore accounts. The judgment called these omissions not oversights, but a pattern of opacity that shattered public trust. For the first time in living memory, the Supreme Court declared that a sitting Prime Minister had committed repeated and deliberate breaches of financial transparency, and with those words came the unthinkable, a binding order demanding that the Prime Minister resign. The courtroom gasped as Dame Sue Carr's voice cut through the silence. No Prime Minister can remain in power when trust has been so deliberately broken. The rule of law does not bend for politics, and it does not bow to power. The declaration was not advisory, not a suggestion, but an enforceable command, the first of its kind in modern British democracy. A Prime Minister had been found unfit for office by the very guardians of the Constitution, and the political system was left staggering under the weight of its implications. Inside Westminster, panic erupted instantly. Politicians, aides, and journalists scrambled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. Within minutes, headlines exploded across every platform. Supreme Court orders PM to resign. The BBC, usually restrained in tone, described it as a constitutional detonation. The Guardian called it the most seismic ruling of the century. Even the Daily Mail, long hostile to Labour, admitted that the implications went far beyond party politics. Outside Parliament Square, protesters who had been gathering in smaller numbers for weeks suddenly erupted into chants of "Resign now!" Placards demanding accountability were hoisted into the air, and the fury of the people began to spill into the streets. Social media platforms became a battlefield of outrage, with hashtags like #Starmer scandal and #Resign now climbing to the top of global trends in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, behind the black door of number 10, silence and shock gripped the corridors of power. Advisors frantically drafted emergency statements, but every second of delay only deepened the crisis. Opposition leaders seized the moment. Standing outside Parliament, Rishi Sunak thundered into the cameras. The rule of law is not optional. No leader, however powerful, can stand above the judgment of the court. Keir Starmer must resign, and he must resign now. His words sent shockwaves through the political establishment, echoed and amplified by Nigel Farage, who declared the ruling a historic reckoning for a failed Prime Minister. But it wasn't just opposition parties sharpening their knives. Cracks inside Labour began to spread like fractures through glass. Senior figures who had once stood by Starmer fell silent, refusing to defend him. Leaked WhatsApp messages revealed the chaos. One senior Labour MP wrote, "We have no plan, no defence. If Keir doesn't go, we all go down with him." Another admitted that the scandal was radioactive, warning that no campaign strategy could survive the storm. Even Labour's staunchest allies in the media began turning, with sympathetic outlets demanding accountability and editorial boards calling for Starmer's immediate exit. The Prime Minister, however, offered nothing in response. No apology, no acknowledgement, no televised address, only silence. His refusal to act, to even speak, became a symbol of defiance that only enraged the public further. Outside Downing Street, the crowd swelled into the thousands, chanting louder with every passing hour. Placards branded with "The court has spoken" and "No one above the law" filled the streets, while television screens replayed the verdict on loop. For many, this was not just a scandal, it was a betrayal by a man who had once promised to clean up politics. A barrister who had built his career on justice, now caught defying the very law he once upheld. And yet, even as the storm raged, whispers began to spread of something even darker. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the court's ruling, dug deeper into the financial trail. Leaks suggested that the 124,000 tiao was just the beginning, a small piece of a much larger puzzle of undeclared donations, offshore ties, and questionable dealings. MI5 was quietly briefed on potential foreign links to the scandal, and the spectre of international interference loomed over the crisis. What began as a domestic scandal was now threatening to spiral into a national security emergency. Britain stood on the brink. The Supreme Court had spoken with unflinching clarity. The people were rising in fury. Parliament was on edge, and yet the man at the centre of it all remained silent. Each hour that passed without action deepened the crisis. Each day stretched the fabric of democracy thinner. The nation was no longer simply watching a scandal, it was witnessing a constitutional showdown that could redefine the future of British politics forever. The fallout from the Supreme Court's ruling spread faster than anyone in Westminster could contain. What began as a scandal over a missing £124,000 had now snowballed into the most severe constitutional crisis of the century. Lawmakers from every corner of the political spectrum were forced into an impossible dilemma: stand by a leader condemned by the nation's highest court, or abandon him and risk tearing their own party apart. Within hours of the judgment, the Tory benches demanded an emergency session of Parliament. Their message was blunt: a vote of no confidence must be called immediately. Standing before a crowd of cameras outside Parliament, Rishi Sunak delivered his fiercest attack yet. His voice shook with anger as he declared, "The Supreme Court has spoken. The law is clear. No Prime Minister can ignore the judgment of the court and expect to remain in office. Keir Starmer must resign, and he must do so today." The statement was met with roaring approval from Conservative MPs and thunderous applause from protesters who had gathered outside. But the real drama was unfolding within Labour itself. The party that had marched confidently toward government now found itself collapsing under the weight of its leader's disgrace. Senior ministers, who just weeks earlier praised Starmer's discipline, had gone silent, refusing to appear in interviews. Inside Labour headquarters, panic-consumed strategy meetings, leaked messages revealed the despair. One senior official admitted, "We are finished if he stays. This scandal is poison. Every word we speak will sound like a lie until he goes." Another message, leaked to the press, was even more devastating. "This isn't damage control anymore. This is survival." The cracks within Labour's leadership widened by the hour, with MPs openly questioning whether their party could survive the scandal if Starmer clung to power. Outside the walls of Westminster, the fury of the public had grown into a storm. Parliament Square filled with a sea of protesters, their chants echoing through the capital. Banners demanding "Resign now" and "No leader above the law" fluttered above the crowds, while demonstrators shouted, "The court has spoken." The anger wasn't confined to London. In Manchester, thousands gathered in Albert Square, staging mock trials and chanting "Guilty" as they replayed the Supreme Court's verdict through megaphones. In Glasgow, a towering effigy of Starmer was paraded through the streets, wrapped in paper chains marked with the figure £124,000, and yet the silence from Number 10 remained deafening. Advisors urged Starmer to make a televised address to calm the fury, but he refused. According to leaks from insiders, the Prime Minister was defensive, unwilling to admit wrongdoing, and convinced that time would cool the anger. Instead, whispers emerged that his legal team was preparing a counterattack, arguing that the Supreme Court had overstepped its authority by issuing a binding resignation order. But constitutional lawyers dismantled this claim within hours. Former judges and scholars appeared on television, stating bluntly that the ruling was not only lawful but essential. One retired justice declared, "This judgment is morally definitive. To defy it is to defy the foundations of our democracy." Their words reverberated across the airwaves, further isolating Starmer from the nation he once promised to serve with integrity. The press circled like vultures, scenting the downfall of a prime minister. Outside Downing Street, journalists camped day and night, their cameras fixed on the black door. Helicopters buzzed overhead, broadcasting live footage of even the smallest movements in and out of Number 10. Every whisper from inside was dissected on television panels, every rumor amplified into headline news. The silence from Starmer, instead of buying him time, became its own scandal. Commentators declared that his refusal to act was proof of denial, arrogance, and desperation. Piers Morgan, in one of the most quoted broadcasts of the crisis, thundered, "This is not leadership. This is cowardice dressed as silence. The court has spoken, the people are speaking, and yet the Prime Minister says nothing. Britain deserves better." The anger only intensified as fresh leaks poured into the media. Investigative journalists uncovered evidence that the 124,000 property scandal might be only the beginning. Reports surfaced of offshore accounts linked to wealthy donors who had mysteriously benefited from lucrative government contracts. Whispers of lobbying money from abroad, quietly funneled into campaign coffers, began to circulate in the press. MI5 was said to be reviewing financial communications tied to the Prime Minister's advisors, raising the spectre of foreign influence in British politics. If these suspicions were confirmed, the scandal would escalate from a matter of political corruption to a full-blown national security emergency. Suddenly, the crisis was no longer just about one leader's dishonesty. It threatened the credibility of Britain on the global stage. International pressure mounted rapidly. European leaders postponed key trade negotiations, unwilling to deal with a government so visibly in disarray. The United States issued a carefully worded statement emphasizing the importance of accountability and urging Britain to resolve the crisis swiftly. Financial markets reacted with brutal efficiency. The pound dropped sharply, government bonds wavered, and investors began to fear that Britain's stability was cracking under the weight of political turmoil. Economists warned of lasting damage if the crisis continued, predicting a drop in consumer confidence and a surge in borrowing costs. The scandal that began with a single property sale was now rippling outward into every corner of national life: politics, economy, diplomacy, and security. Inside Labour, the implosion was accelerating. Shadow ministers cancelled media appearances, MPs dodged interviews, and senior officials struggled to keep their party from falling apart. Union leaders, once Labour's staunchest allies, turned their backs. Unite the Union, one of Labour's biggest backers, issued a statement demanding total accountability from those in public office. Though they did not name Starmer directly, the implication was undeniable. Behind closed doors, rumours swirled of resignations being drafted by senior cabinet members who no longer wanted to be tainted by the scandal. Angela Rayner, Labour's deputy leader, was reported to be in secret talks with party officials, quietly preparing to step in as interim leader if the crisis became terminal. The Commons grew louder and more hostile with every session. Conservatives banged their desks, Reform UK MPs shouted calls for resignation. By the end of the second day of silence, Britain was teetering on the edge of something far darker than scandal. The protest outside Parliament had swelled into tens of thousands, with demonstrators camping overnight. Intense, vowing not to leave until the Prime Minister was gone. Police lines struggled to contain the swelling crowds, while social media flooded with footage of confrontations between protesters and security forces. Commentators described the mood as electric, dangerous, and revolutionary. The Supreme Court had lit the match, and Starmer's silence had poured fuel on the fire. Britain was no longer simply waiting for a resignation. It was demanding it, louder and more furiously with every passing hour. The storm surrounding Keir Starmer is no longer confined to political circles. It has spilled into the very institutions meant to uphold democracy and safeguard accountability. The UK Supreme Court's intervention has shifted the crisis from political theatre to a matter of constitutional reckoning. What began as whispers of a financial discrepancy worth £124,000 has now erupted into a scandal that not only questions the Labour leader's judgment, but also his integrity. The ruling from the highest court is not an advisory opinion, it is a legally binding directive demanding Starmer's resignation. This is not just another scandal that can be brushed aside with a press release or a carefully crafted statement. It is a judgment that carries the weight of law and the force of national outrage. For the first time in decades, a party leader has been confronted with an ultimatum from the judiciary, and the shockwaves have left the political class trembling. What makes this moment even more explosive is the growing realization that Starmer's fate may already be sealed, not by his political opponents, but by his own mistakes and the unforgiving hand of justice. The 124,000 scandal has been painted as a mere financial miscalculation by Starmer's defenders, but the documents presented to the Supreme Court tell a far darker story. Allegations of misuse, misdirection of funds, and concealment of records point to something far more sinister than an innocent error. The court, after weeks of deliberation, confirmed that there was clear evidence of mismanagement and an intentional attempt to withhold information from both Parliament and the public. This revelation shattered any illusion of transparency that Starmer once prided himself on. Instead of the champion of integrity he claimed to be, the court's findings portray a leader ensnared in deceit. Every page of the judgment paints a grim picture, showing not just negligence but deliberate evasion, a move that has deeply offended both the legal community and ordinary citizens who demand accountability from those who lead them. The sheer brazenness of the findings has transformed the narrative from a scandal into a national betrayal. Within hours of the ruling, Westminster was plunged into pandemonium. Opposition leaders seized the moment, declaring that Starmer could no longer legitimately hold office. Nigel Farage, leader of Reform, UK, wasted no time in blasting Starmer as a man unfit to lead, condemned by the very laws he swore to uphold. Conservative figures echoed the sentiment, demanding immediate resignation and an emergency leadership contest. Even Labour MPs, once tightly bound under Starmer's leadership, began to fracture. Some publicly called for him to step aside, while others retreated into silence, unwilling to be tied to a sinking ship. The halls of Parliament, usually buzzing with calculated debate, turned into a battleground of accusations, finger-pointing, and hushed whispers of betrayal. Starmer, once feared for his sharp wit and political strategy, suddenly appeared cornered, weakened, and stripped of authority. His attempts to project control fell flat as the words of the Supreme Court judgment overshadowed every defense he tried to muster. The public reaction was equally unforgiving. Across the country, outrage spilled into the streets, into workplaces, and onto social media